Alright folks, welcome back to the Don's channel. I am the Don Father and I'm about to do a reaction now for a patron of ours, Brenda Harrell. Thank you very much, Brenda, for your support. It is greatly appreciated. And Brenda has requested a little historical video here that I'm looking forward to covering for you. It's the US general who was king of the swamps, the swamp fox. It's not a story that I am personally familiar with, so I'm really looking forward to learning a little bit about it. The link to the original video, as always, will be in the description section below, as will our Patreon account if you'd like to become a patron like Brenda and get your requests through that way. We've also launched brand new tiers that see you receiving, for your continued loyalty on Patreon, different levels of merchandise directly through Patreon. They handle all the production of the merchandise and the delivery, so check that out if that's something you'd be interested in. Or also join our channel as a member to get personalised video requests and shout outs through that way as well. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment and share and put the bell on. Thank you very much. Anyway, this is the US general who was king of the swamps, the swamp fox. No more talking. Let's go.
The sun has barely dropped below the South Carolina hills, and already the night is turning frosty. Icy cold mud sucks and pulls at the boots of 100 British redcoats as they struggle to set up camp for the night. Each man is miserable, shivering even through his thick wool coat, and not looking forward to spending another night in the muck and stink of the South Carolina swamplands. It's bad enough that the American colonists have rebelled against the crown and dared to challenge the most powerful empire in history for their independence. If it wasn't for the damned French and the ever-pestering Spanish back in Europe, this rebellion would have been put down in months. The full might of the British Empire descending on the rebel colonies like a stern parent disciplining a misbehaving child. The gumption of these colonists to complain and rebel, while the rest of the empire accepts its burden for the glory of the crown. To make matters worse, the rebel colonists have refused to wage war like gentlemen, no doubt fully aware that they could never match the discipline, training, and gallantry of proper British fighting men. Instead, the Americans strike out unexpectedly, using militia forces to lure British regulars into what they believe will be a stand-up battle, only to be ambushed and bushwhacked by American irregulars from the rear. The Americans fight like savages, no better than the natives, or the French for that matter. This war is proving to be particularly troublesome and especially unpleasant. As the British redcoats set up their camp, the weary men establish a rotation of sentries. The swamp is dark and the knee-high water freezing. None of the sentries or the officers in command seriously believe they're in danger of attack here, but one must always be dutiful. The sentries are tired after days of trudging through these swamps, seeking out a rumored force of Americans hiding out here, men led by a general whom has earned himself the name of Swamp Fox for the disgraceful hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and general bushwhackery. The Swamp Fox has savaged British supply lines for weeks and taken much plunder and booty, helping to keep the regular colonial militias armed and supplied, while denying those same critical supplies for British forces.
Right, so at this point then, just before we get lost in more details, the swamp fox is an absolute nuisance or a pest, and as what it would suggest in this video to the British forces, who generally probably looked at this as not really anything to be greatly concerned about, a little bit tired, maybe a little bit unrespectful of what they were coming up against, maybe not taking it or the threat, sorry, too seriously, could prove costly. You should always, although weary, be ready for all kinds of attacks. And I know and I appreciate what they were saying, fighting the French and the Spanish on multiple fronts, and wondering why these colonists would rebel against the crown, maybe taking it for granted that people just don't want to recognise the crown, or kind of be ruled by it as such. So yeah, so far so good. I'm quite enjoying the story. Personally, I know that the regiment I served in would have been part of the redcoats and probably fought in this particular battle. I'll have to check the details of that, but it's certainly a story that's really gripping to learn a little bit more about.
A short distance from the camp, a pair of eyes watches the British sentries as they struggle to keep awake and warm in the cold night. The muddy waters are icy, the temperature hovering just above freezing. But none of this phases Francis Marion, the man known to his adversaries as the Swamp Fox. His face has been blackened with charcoal and his military uniform dulled with mud and stained through with green and brown pigments. Behind him in the dark, 24 other men dressed similarly wait silently. They've learned to strike when least expected, to allow the British to lull themselves into a false sense of security. Nobody, and certainly no proper British-trained officer, would ever expect an attack in the wee hours of night, and certainly not from an enemy willing to silently cross through miles of freezing cold swampland in the pitch black.
Okay, so at this point, of course, this is probably what you would look upon as the learning curve for British forces, and I'd imagine now, well, I know now that that simply would never be the case. You always have sentries. You're not really going to fight battles like that as such anymore in modern conflicts, but say for example you were and you were camped up like that in a forest. Obviously this is swamp, so they're soaked up to the knee in water, it's stinking, it's freezing, they're tired, they're probably hungry as well as maybe injured from other battles, but the art of deception could possibly have been learned from this sort of guerrilla tactics, this bushwhackery as they call it, attacking in the dead of night. You simply wouldn't expect anything other than that sort of thing to be happening now, and it's probably down to these sorts of things throughout history. You're not going to get caught out like that anymore. You're basically ready for all eventualities, and an enemy that's probably weaker in terms of training, equipment, experience, etc. They have to play to their own strengths as well and attack at night where they're least likely to be overrun by a well-trained army. Let's be honest here, the Redcoats, the British, were the best empire on the planet at the time, but stretched on multiple fronts, so the opportunistic nature for the Swamp Fox certainly played into his hands at this point.
Hours, Marion and his men wait, each bearing the extreme cold and discomfort stoically, never once muttering as much as a single complaint. Finally, after the change of the second watch, Marion looks over his shoulder and nods silently at his second-in-command. It's time. The second watch will be headed to their bedrolls. Most of the camp will be in the midst of fitful sleep, and the third watch sentries struggle to wake themselves up while longing for the minor comforts of their tents. With silent hand and arm signals, Marion commands his men to spread out in a skirmish line. They slowly approach the British camp, their stained and darkened tunics making each man nothing more than a shadowy apparition in the moonless night. The British sentries, no doubt secure in their belief that no madman would dare launch an offensive against such a large unit through such terrible terrain, don't expect a thing. Now, within a few dozen yards, Marion lets out another hand signal and the skirmish line freezes. Several men slowly make their way forward. These are Marion's sharpshooters, hand-picked as the finest shots in this small command of irregulars. Moments of silence hang heavy in the dark swamp, broken only by the splintering of logs from the roaring British fires. Then, with a nod, the sharpshooters open fire. 4 sentries are immediately down, 2 men each targeting the same sentry to ensure a swift kill. Despite the sharp cracks of rifles, the rest of the British camp is in disbelief for a few moments. Marion and his men charge forward, though not a single battle cry escapes their lips. The men are silent, wraiths descending on a slowly waking British camp, hell-bent on death and destruction. A few moments later, alarmed shouts ring out, realization dawning on the British force. Men struggle to rise from their bedrolls and pick up rifles as Marion and his raiders breach the perimeter. Torches are quickly lit and tossed at canvas tents. Other men pick up blazing logs from the British's own fires and set more tents ablaze. In moments, roaring fires begin to spread across the camp. The roar of rifles overtakes the camp, Marion himself felling a British lieutenant as he exited his tent. The colonists are vastly outnumbered and outgunned in this fight for independence, and have found that killing officers, something utterly unimaginable on a European battlefield, has helped to level the odds by sowing confusion and chaos amongst the British ranks. Now British officers are primary targets, and quickly becoming an endangered species on the American continent. His rifle spent, Marion slings it across his shoulder and grabs a pistol at his belt, dropping yet another British soldier exiting his tent. Marion's men follow suit, firing rifles and switching to pistols, and finally, each man unsheaths their own personal close-quarters weapon. Some of the raiders carry Indian tomahawks, others large knives and axes. Marion carries a saber, lifted from the corpse of a slain British officer. In the close quarters of the British camp, the combat very quickly becomes hand-to-hand. The British are in complete disarray, even as surviving officers struggle to get a handle on the situation. The surprise attack has caught the British unit completely off guard. They simply do not teach nighttime swamp ambushes or how to react to one in the officer schools of the British Empire. Yet the British forces vastly outnumber this small band of raiders, and if the men can be rallied, then the attack can be repelled. A British officer lifts himself up onto his horse, calling out above the din of the hand-to-hand slaughter. Atop his horse, he is a visible beacon for the British forces to rally around, and the added stature grants him authority that helps combat the panic spreading through the British troops. It also makes him a very easy target. A single sharp crack sounds from the swamp a few dozen yards outside the camp. The British officer falls from his horse. Ringing the camp, Marion has stationed individual sharpshooters who take their time loading their muskets and carefully selecting targets of opportunity amidst the chaos. The raid is bold, and the British have been taken completely by surprise, yet the 24-strong raiding party is vastly outnumbered. Marion ducks a wild stab from a young redcoat and dispatches the unfortunate recruit in swift fashion. Then, putting fingers to his lips, he lets out 2 sharp, loud whistles. All around the camp, Marion's men immediately disengage from the fight, rushing back into the dark swamps. At first, the British give chase, but the sharpshooters Marion has placed around the perimeter of the camp drop redcoats one by one. Seeing their compatriots fall to invisible rifles in the pitch-black swamp, the rest of the men second-guess their decision to give chase. In moments, the swamp is silent again. Marion and his raiders are long gone. The British rush to put out the fires consuming their tents and supplies, while others tend to the wounded. There aren't many wounded men. Marion's men brutally efficient in their hand-to-hand combat. By the time dawn breaks, the British men will count 32 killed, 10 wounded, with 7 dead American raiders. Most of their supplies have been lost to the fires, and what wasn't consumed by flames was stolen by a band of rebels that used the chaos of the raid as a cover to plunder precious supplies. The British unit will be forced to turn back out of the swamps, regroup, and resupply. The British are now utterly infuriated with the colonist rebel who has made the swamps of South Carolina and adjacent states his hunting ground. Colonel Bannister Tarleton has been dispatched from New York to hunt down Francis Marion, and word has quickly reached the Americans thanks to an extensive network of rebel spies and informants. Tarleton is frustrated almost immediately upon arriving in South Carolina. He is fully aware that the American colonel is himself aware of Tarleton's arrival, and his mission to seek him out and destroy him and his men. Yet the British are themselves all but blind to the movements of the Americans or their intentions. A small contingent of loyalists feed the British information when possible, but this is nothing compared to the sophisticated spy ring that the colonial rebels have established across the East Coast. Not a single British unit can move without the American forces knowing size, composition, and destination. All of this is deeply frustrating for Tarleton, who is the closest that the British have to a man that can match Marion's talents for irregular warfare, a highly skilled cavalryman. Tarleton and his light cavalry forces are quick and can maneuver through difficult terrain better than the British regulars. His keen hunting instincts make him confident that he can find the elusive American colonel, causing so much trouble for the crown. Plunging into the swamps with a force of 150 men, Tarleton doesn't repeat the mistakes of previous British forces. He makes good use of scouts, sending men out ahead of his formation to seek out the trails and passes through which the ghost-like Marion and his men move through the vast swamps. He fails, however, to make use of scouts to secure his flanks, a mistake he'll only make once, as he and his men wander into a carefully planned ambush. Marion and his men strike at both flanks of Tarleton's formation, taking the British colonel by surprise. A dozen or more men fall in the first volley, and the rest of Tarleton's company rushes to find cover behind trees and fallen logs. This is no gentleman's war and far from the orderly formations of soldiers who march upon each other on declared fields of battle and take turns loosing volleys of fire against one another. This is the devil's own.
This is exactly it, and I think that it's something that the British clearly have had to adapt to in this sort of warfare, was the fact that you're not standing in perfectly fine ranks with volley fire, with a sort of war rules of engagement back then, the way they were. You literally have to, when you're dragged into this guerrilla warfare type tactics, this bushwhackery as they've already called it, you have to fight fire with fire and become like the enemy in order to defeat the enemy. When you're sitting in open ranks and you're allowing yourself to be flanked, you're just target practice for these men. They're not going to fight the normal way. They're prepared to go to old tomahawks and stuff and fight hand to hand with you. They're aggressive, they're bold, their art of deception's phenomenal, their use of spies is fantastic. But since he's came, he's obviously got them a little bit on the back foot, but the colonists are more than prepared to still set up ambushes on the flanks of this British group that is searching for them. I like the British use of pretty much the reconnaissance, sending out spies. It's reconnaissance, gathering information on the enemy. I mean, this is all stuff that you would do in modern warfare today. The use of reconnaissance and information gathering is crucial to fighting any opposing army or enemy, whatever it may be you're coming up against. Also want to point out the use of sharpshooters by the Swamp Fox is fantastic. The best way to disrupt enemy command and control, which happens to be the Redcoats, the British here, is by taking out their command one by one and working your way down. And his ability to positionally place these sharpshooters, not only for entry into the swamp forest there, etc., but also on the withdrawal, he still had the sharpshooters in position for any enemy that may chase after him. I am really enjoying this story so far, and I can see a lot of parallels and stuff that you would do today in warfare, from possibly a huge learning curve for the British here in this particular battle.
War, an ungentlemanly display of violent vulgarity, and Tarleton is ill prepared for it. Marion, on the other hand, is a seasoned professional of this new type of war. His men loose volleys in rapid succession, and after a predetermined number of firings by each man, they begin to break away in pairs. Two men slink back toward the safety of the swamp as another pair loose a volley of fire at the British. This ensures that any pursuit will be delayed as long as possible. The British regulars hesitant to poke their heads up as long as the Americans are still firing. Marion's men grew up on this land, hunting and trapping for a living. They are crack shots to a man and know the terrain. Marion and his forces break off the attack completely after only a few minutes. His strategy is simple. Rather than face the superior British forces outright and attempt to destroy them, he is content to simply bleed them dry one skirmish at a time. The tactic is incredibly effective, and Marion's lightning raids are serving to destroy the morale of the British regulars and tie down sizable amounts of forces as the British attempt to secure their supply lines and rear areas. This in turn means less redcoats for the colonial militias to face, and that's good because the war has been largely disastrous for the colonists. The British have handed the rebels defeat after crushing defeat, and American victories are few and far between. Yet, the British are definitely losing the war, and Tarleton grits his teeth in barely contained rage. Marion and his irregular tactics are only highlighting a crippling problem for the British forces. Their supply lines stretch across the Atlantic to Britain and beyond, and every loss of men and material weakens all British forces on the continent. Marion and his raids are having a far more disastrous effect on the British efforts than he realizes. To make matters worse, the damned American is proving impossible to corner. Raid after raid, Marion and his men break off from Tarleton's forces slinking back into the swamp. They retreat into the deepest parts of the swamp where pursuit by even Tarleton's cavalry is impossible. He's already lost 6 horses to the treacherous terrain and 24 to the constant raids. Tarleton yearns for a stand-up fight to corner this damned swamp fox and cut off all possibility of retreat. If he could manage such a feat, he would handily defeat Marion and his forces, ending the scourge once and for all. For weeks, the two men play a game of cat and mouse across the deep swamps of the Carolinas. The rest of the war is all but forgotten for the two commanders and their soldiers, the two sides now locked in a very personal and private war all their own. Tarleton proves himself to be a brilliant tactician and very fast to adapt his tactics, but Marion is the keener mind here. He has pioneered a new type of war and proven very adept in its execution. Bled of men and supplies and frustrated in every attempt, Tarleton is forced to retreat. His men are bloodied and demoralized. Food and other vital stocks are running low. What hasn't been used up has been victimized by Marion and his damned raiders time and again. For his part, the Swamp Fox has proven as elusive as his namesake and managed to evade Tarleton time and again. The duel is over, Tarleton grudgingly admitting defeat. Both sides have bled and suffered their private war, but Marion and his raiders have proven the superior. Now the two brilliant and gifted commanders will return to the war at large, but only one of them will be remembered by history. The American Revolutionary War will end shortly after the swamp duels with victory of the colonists, due in no small part to their French allies. Marion will retire from military command to serve as a politician, but his real legacy will be in the lessons he forged at the dawn of a new age of warfare. 2 centuries later, Marion's expertise in irregular warfare will serve to heavily influence American Special Forces, with the United States Army Rangers considering him their founding father. If you like this video and want to see more, then don't worry, we have 2 great options for you. Click on one of the 2 videos for more great content that we know you're gonna love.
Well, that's the end of the video, and what can I say? Marion was an evil genius. He really was. I mean, obviously at the end there it said how he's went into politics, but that is irrelevant. He will be remembered for, as they probably called it, the birth of the Special Forces. Special Forces would use a lot of guerrilla warfare type tactics like that as well. The art of deception, going in at the dead of night, attacking the enemy when they least expect it, when they're at their most vulnerable, when they're sleeping, when they're hungry, when they're weak, when they're depleted. They just go in and get the job done, and a lot of that does run parallel to what Marion was doing here. He had them stretched, he attacked, but he didn't fight them head on for too long. He knew that if he engaged in a longer battle, he would probably, or more than likely, have been defeated by the British army there, who were superior. So he got in, created havoc, killed a few and got out, and this was bleeding them dry, as they put it, chipping away at the morale of the British forces there. When you're hungry, your supply line for food has been stopped, your ammunition's probably running low, you're wounded, you've no way of getting medical supplies to you. They know the terrain, they know that the cavalry can't follow them into these parts of the swamp, so he's used his knowledge of the local terrain to an absolute T. His men grew up in the area, they were all good sharpshooters and good hunters, and they obviously followed Marion's word to the T, and their discipline at what they were doing was nothing short of phenomenal, to tell you the truth. I know at that time it wouldn't be a respectful art of war as what the British would have been used to fighting in European fronts with the French and the Spanish, etc. But for the colonists, they simply couldn't do that. They wouldn't have been able to win that sort of battle, so they used their own strengths to their advantage and caused absolute havoc on the British there. That was an incredible story, and yes, there was a lot of it that I could relate to in modern warfare tactics, although you're starting to see even that fade out now with the use of drones. There's so much different types of technology being used now that the normal infantry soldier, I wouldn't say it is becoming obsolete, but it's becoming less prevalent or less necessary as what there used to be for Western forces. There's smarter ways to fight than sending men into an area that they don't know and basically just get picked off and slaughtered. You have to fight to your strengths and your advantage in every warfare, and I think the West now is flying the flag for modern, more modern types of warfare, and that is, as I say, showing less necessity for the normal infantry. Brilliant video, thanks very much for the request. As I said, the link to the original video will be in the description section below if you want to watch it again. So will our Patreon account if you'd like a personalised video request and shout out, check that out, or simply join the channel as a member. Don't forget to subscribe, like, comment and share, and put the bell on. Thank you very much for watching, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.